Good morning. I hope this sermon finds you doing well and healthy. I pray that the Lord is with you and blessing you through this time of distance and isolation. This morning we're going to continue in our study of the Sermon on the Mount of Jesus in Matthew chapter 5. Last week we talked through the Beatitudes, which we talked about how this was Jesus reshaping almost the values of what His kingdom is all about. And kind of setting us up for what it means to be a disciple or a follower of Christ. And those Beatitudes were supposed to be something that was kind of shocking, that kind of caught us off guard, something that maybe would have gone against the culture of the time, and I think when we looked at it last week, even against our culture today in this time. Well, today we were going to pick up where we left off from last time, and that's going to start in verse 11. Now, when we read this, you'll notice it kind of starts similar to what we did a second ago. But before we get into it, there's one thing that I want to talk about, and it's actually something that with my heritage, I feel like I have a greater grasp on this than maybe other people, but it's y'all. And it's that word y'all and how we use that. See, one thing that happens with a biblical text that a lot of times we're not aware of is the plural you. Is we see when we read a lot of times there'll be just plain old you. And at least in the southern context, you is one person and y'all is, well, you all. It's everybody. And when we read the Bible, there isn't that wonderful little extra description there. But I think it's important that we understand when it's plural and when it's not, because for the Greek listener, for the person reading this when it was first written, they would understand that distinction. They would know that, for example, in this case, Jesus is talking to all of His disciples and not necessarily singling out one. I think if we study the context, you can realize, obviously, Jesus is not just talking to one person in this group, but instead He's talking to the whole group. But I think it's important that we know that going in, at least for this passage, because I think with our culture and with our American civilization, when we read these passages, we really quickly think of them only in singular terms. But I want you to know that all of the yous we're going to read in today's passage is actually y'all. It's meant to be the whole group. It's meant to be the church, so to speak. So I thought it was interesting we know that going forward. If you're looking for this, I really don't have a great solution other than looking at the original Greek and trying to figure out whether it's plural or singular. A lot of translations don't do a lot to try to help you know the difference, and sometimes it does change within a passage. I know in the Gospel of John that happens a couple of times. But for the purpose of this morning, everything we're going to read is that plural you. It's talking to all of the disciples. Jesus is preaching this sermon, and He's talking to them collectively. So when we start in verse 11, sounds familiar. Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. For so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. Now, when you hear the blessed at the beginning, you would almost think, hey, this is a beatitude. But something changes here. He goes from talking about blessed are they will be blessed, to you, this plural you, talking to the group that's in front of them. And for that reason, a lot of people don't know if this is a beatitude. Some people call it the ninth beatitude. You could really go either way. But the way I look at it is it's really transitioning to this little passage that's going to come before Jesus really starts to break down His relationship to the law, which is what we'll look at after this one. But it kind of transitions from the Beatitudes to the existence of a disciple and what being a disciple is really all about. Well, you notice here He says, blessed are you, so it's a good thing, right? Like we talked about last week, happy, fortunate, all those words, different connotations, right? But it's this idea that this is a good thing when you are reviled and persecuted and have evil of all kinds uttered against you. And it says, falsely on my account. Now, obviously, the first thing you got to notice is on His account. It's not blessed are we if we're just made fun of and all these other bad things for bad things that we do. No, what He's talking about is when we follow Him and that happens, we should consider that a good thing. Now, why should we consider that a good thing? Well, not because that in and of itself is great. It's not great that I'm being persecuted or made fun of or reviled or whatever it is. But actually, later it says, rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. We know that the promise is better than whatever we're going through in the moment. We know that it's not the suffering that is the blessing, it's a promised outcome that Jesus tells us time and time again through His teaching and then on into the epistles as well. But blessed are we when we go through those bad things, and we should rejoice and be glad, for our reward is great in heaven. And then he closes by saying, so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. You know, I think if we find ourselves in a situation of persecution, it is of comfort to know that throughout history, God's people had faced persecution. You look through the Old Testament, you look in the first century, the stories of the disciples themselves, the apostles, you see time and time again of this. And our world is not absent of people being persecuted for their faith. And it's a great comfort to know that this is the history of being a God follower, is that, you know, Jesus Himself led the way in that. We can have comfort in knowing that everyone who follows Christ in this way will face some sort of difficulty or persecution. Well, he goes on from there in verse 13. And he changes the metaphor to a pretty common one. If you've read Scripture or really just been around Christians, you've probably heard this before. But it's this metaphor of salt. In verse 13, he says, you are the salt of the earth. But if salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled under people's feet. When you think of the first century context, there was a lot of different uses for salt. I think one of the things I saw was a list of 12 different ways that salt was used in the first century. And that list is long, and there's a lot of different things that salt ends up being used for. I think in a lot of ways, you know, we have things like that today, that like duct tape, right? We kind of look at it as the fix-all of things. And when it came to their existence in that time, salt was really used for a wide array of things. But kind of the two most common ones, and we see this to a certain degree today, is flavoring and preservation. Those were kind of the main two things that if you lived in the first century, that was the thing that you used salt for. You used it to flavor foods, or you used it to preserve food before things like refrigerators. You look in the writings of this time, and many different people attest to it really being a basic necessity for life then. It was just something you had to have. I mean, to make your food last long enough, right, in that hot Middle Eastern sun, you had to have something to make it last so that it didn't spoil quickly, and salt was one of the common things that was used for that. Now he goes on and he says, if it's lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? Now, knowing chemistry as we do today, this is impossible. I think even in Jesus' context, I think he knew that salt in and of itself couldn't lose its saltiness. I think they were aware of that. I don't think that was some kind of new information, whether they understood chemistry as we do today or not. But now we know for certain that salt doesn't lose its saltiness. But what exactly is Jesus saying here when he says this? Well, I think it's possible he's trying to communicate essentially one of two different things. One is it was very common in that day that the salt that they had may not have been a pure, exact salt. It may have been mixed with other things. And so it's very possible that people were well aware of maybe having a block of salt or a mixture of salt that the salt loses. And you're eventually left with whatever that other thing is, whether that be, rock or minerals, whatever it was. They're aware when that salt is gone. And if it's washed away, for example, in some of the cases, or whatever that was, if that salt is gone, you can't find those little granules of salt and put it back. So in one sense, he could be talking about this idea of mixing salt and causing this kind of impurity. But I think the other is very possible as well, as he's just saying, look, it doesn't make sense for salt not to be salty. It's like saying if water loses its wet, right? It's kind of this thing of saying, yeah, if salt loses its saltiness, how are you going to gain that back? It's lost its defining characteristic. How is it going to just become salt all over again? I think either one of these is possible, but the main idea here is that losing this essence of what salt was all about. Now, what do we say it was used for? I think this is a good place to start when we understand it. Flavoring and preservation. right? Salt is supposed to add something to whatever it's added. It's supposed to help add that certain amount of flavoring. And I think there's a whole tangent you could go down about having too much salt. We've all experienced that before, at least on the flavoring side. But on the preservation side, right, you want that. You want a lot of salt. You want it there to make sure that other bacteria doesn't come in. So there's very important purposes that salt has. And he's making this metaphor saying that we as Christians, we have these purposes. And when we added to the world, we're supposed to be distinct. We're supposed to stand out. We're supposed to flavor. We're supposed to make things better and also preserve, really, the foundation of the good, right? That's what preservation is you're saving the good and keeping it from the spoiling of whatever is bad. So that is what he's saying. He's saying, hey, this is what we're supposed to be for the world. We are the salt of the earth. One interesting thing before we move on, this verb here, when it says becoming tasteless or losing its taste, it's actually kind of a pun. It's also the idea of becoming foolish. This word was used in this way. So here Jesus is saying, if it becomes tasteless, almost a nice little pun here, hey, a Christian can become foolish. We can become lost. We can get away from the wisdom of God and follow the path of folly. But I think it's interesting there that's a nice little pun that we may have not picked up on. But then he goes on in verse 14, and he also says, you are the light of the world. This is my reminder. Remember, this is a y'all, right? You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a stand, and it gives light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven. You are the light of the world. A light's job is to illuminate. You think about that. It's not for its own purpose. We have lights so that we can see our way, so that we can shine light and see more clearly of certain things. One thing about this recording that we've been doing, you may not notice it, and hopefully it kind of goes unnoticed, but the reason it looks better quality is because we have good lighting. A lot of times you can see that when you watch a video with bad lighting, it's just really hard to see. This light's job is not a selfish one in nature. In fact, if you stare at lights for too long, it hurts your eyes. But lights are really to illuminate other things. And so in the first century context, they knew this all too well. In the dark of night, when you're inside of a building, if you didn't have even just that little bitty lamp that they would carry around, that was enough to see so that they could see their way and not trip over things or not hurt themselves or in some cases avoid dangers. So light had this purpose that was outside of itself. Now the second part of his thing here, we're going to get to later, the city set on a hill. But then he goes on and he says, you don't light this lamp and put it under a basket, but instead you put it on a stand, and it gives light to all the house. So this light, it's selfless in its job. It's helping others. It's helping others to see. And not only is it selfless, but hey, you want to help as many as possible. You don't want to put it over in a corner, but instead you put it on a stand. You try to get it out there so that as many people as can be helped by this. And then the last thing I want you to say is that this good works, he actually just says that's what it is in verse 16. They may see your good works, this light, this illumination, this doing things for others. The purpose of this, the goal, is not just a general improvement of its society. It's not just general fixing things that are wrong, but it's to give glory to our Father. We are shining light. We're doing these good works so that glory is given to God. So that people see, right? That's what this is all about, being a follower of Christ, being a citizen in His kingdom. They look at us and they see the glory of God through us. Now that's a whole sermon in of itself. I mean, that's not our own doing, right? We don't create this light. We don't create this salt. It's not of our own doing, but instead it's Christ. He's the one that gives us righteousness. He's the one that gives us forgiveness. But nonetheless, our goal is to get out, to share that light, to illuminate, to share with as many as possible, and all of that for the sake of bringing glory to the Father. Now finally, this idea of city on a hill. It's interesting that when you think about the first century town, When you think about lights in a first century town, think in terms of those little bitty lights that they had. But yet, if you were away from that town at night and you were, say, out in the wilderness, maybe you even got a little lamp of your own, it's very unlikely that that town sees your one little light. But you standing away from the town, you can see the town because of all the different people that have their lights on. You know, this would have been a common thing for them to understand, but not only that, it talks about it being set on a hill. So whether it's day or night, these cities are set up high, you know, for safety reasons, for protecting those that are around. But nonetheless, this was a common thing that these cities were set up on a hill and they could be seen from all around. But think about it in terms of that light, right? You know, I loved it was kind of boring at the time, but it's been such a great little image that I've had throughout my time is when I was driving through Texas. If you've ever had the joy or the boringness really of driving through Texas at night, you know you can be an hour away from a big city, but you can see that light in the distance. And it feels like you're just driving forever and forever and forever and forever, but that light is still out there. It's still out there. And think about that. That's not just, you know, one major light, but it's all this combination of little lights. See, Jesus is reminding us, you know, if we didn't pick up on the plural U because our translations don't necessarily stand that out, this is where we should stop and think, hey, wait, a city set on a hill. You know, he talks about that lamp being on a stand, personal, but we're a city set on a hill. It's all these lamps being set on a hill. We collectively, we the church, are meant to be this city on a hill, that all of our light shining together you can see for miles around. So let's think about this light here in one more kind of way that I think is cool. Have you ever seen these pictures of the world at night? You know, you look at the one of the United States, and you can see very clearly where some of the big cities are. And then maybe if you were trying really hard to like locate a place like where I grew up, you're not going to see any light from space on that. I mean, you know, maybe there's, you know, kind of the big cities that are 15, 20 minutes away from us. But, you know, it's really those biggest cities, the New Yorks, the Atlantas, that really shine from space, that you can see those. And it's all these collections of little lights. Well, there's one other really cool example, well, not really, it's kind of sad example of this, is look at the one for Korea. If you look at the image from space at night of Korea, you see the obvious line where South Korea is. And South Korea is just lit up with all these big cities and all this light everywhere. And, you know, you can spot the big city Seoul and, you know, all those different ones. But then you look in North Korea and there's really only one light. And it's the capital city of North Korea. Everything else around it is dark. You know, when we think about this idea of light, I know very well that when Jesus said this thousands of years ago, he knew one day we were going to be able to look at images like that. And you just think about the metaphor that shows that, you know, there's many places in the world that are just flat out dark. Flat out dark. You think about maybe going down in Mammoth Cave and they do the whole thing where they turn all the lights off and then they have just a little bitty light. You know, what a difference that light makes. But when you put all those lights together, you think about the big cities, you lift that up on a hill, whatever it is, how far that light and that impact spreads. You know, it's really, when I think about this, I can't help but think of what power we have within the church. Individually, yes, we can be bright lights in a lot of different ways. We can be great salt. But collectively, when we get together, when we work towards a purpose, man, the impact that we can have. And you can look at those images and see some of the biggest cities in the world. And you can see the impact of, you know, putting all those little lights together. When you think about the improvement just in flashlights over the years, flashlights used to just have one little incandescent bulb in the middle. But now you start to see these LED lights. And LED are even brighter, but a lot of them will not just have one, but it'll have multiple lights. Because, see, we've known for a long time that there is strength in numbers. There's safety in numbers. But I want you to know that when we read these passages about being salt and light, that there's great strength in when we do it together. Whatever it is, whatever we're working towards, so much more can be accomplished when we work at it together. We can be that city that's set on the hill. So when we summarize this passage that we've looked at this morning, you know, what do we see when we put this all together? Let's work backwards. Like light, we are to help the world around us see clearly. We're to illuminate into situations where we have the opportunity. We're to show the world how to find their way. When they can't see clearly, we are to show them the purpose in their life. We are to help others. We are to be selfless. Just like that light is not about illuminating itself, but illuminating things for others. We are to have that as our goal. Like salt, we are to be different and distinct. We are to be about preservation and flavoring, making the situations that we are involved in better and helping them to preserve that which is good and keep out that which is bad. We are to do that in a way that doesn't overwhelm someone's taste buds, but in just the right way. That, what did we talk about in that the first part? That glory is brought to God. That these good works of being light and salt in the world, those are done so that glory is given to God. And then working backwards, the first thing we talked about. Unfortunately, not everyone will respond so joyfully to this. If we truly are the light and the salt in the world, the way that we're supposed to be, there will be people who will respond negatively to that. When they do respond negatively, though, however, we can continue to have joy because we realize that the reward that we have ahead of us is greater than whatever that we deal with now. Not only that, I also happen to believe that one day that light can overcome. That if we are patient, if we continue to have joy and continue to persevere, even when people persecute, even when they speak evil, even when they do all these things, that light can overcome. Like Paul says later in his epistle, that we are to overcome evil with good. That is our mission. That is what it means to be a Christ follower. That is what it means to be a citizen in His kingdom. As we read this neat little passage here, many of us know, we've heard so many different sermons from this about being salt and light. This is the start of the Sermon on the Mount. He gave us the values. He gave us the things that we are to strive towards, that things that are blessed, right, that are fortunate, that we can be happy in. And now He tells us we are to be distinct. We are to be out in the world. This light is not put under a basket. It's not about my personal holiness kept in a corner for no one to see. But instead, it's for me to be put on this pedestal, to be that city on a hill that illuminates the landscape around it, that brings this good news to everyone that we can. That is what we are to be. And obviously, we are better when we are together. I know right now we're apart. But I know one day that won't be the case. Whether that's on this earth or on the next one, that I know there will come a day where nothing can keep us apart. We can be with God for eternity and with each other for eternity. My prayer is if you are not a Christian and you're hearing this, that you understand this is promises. These teachings are for you. They're not just for church-going people that sit in pews. These teachings are for each and every one of God's creation. And I pray that you come to know Him and that you slowly, just like all of us had to do, learn more about Him and learn to understand that God is not a God who sits off in a distance and watches us in our misery, but instead He is a God that wants to walk through us and be with us in everything that we go through, that He loves us deeply and He cares for us. And if there's anything we can do to help you know that God and help you to know His will for your life, we would love to help you. Or if you're a Christian or a member of Alvaton and you just need prayers, you need help in whatever situation you find yourself in through all this, whatever your need is, we would love to know that because we want to be this salt and light. We want to be that city set on a hill, that we can be a blessing to everyone that we come into contact with. May the Lord bless you and keep you and make His face to shine upon you. Herp.